So, we're going to be number one. Number one, number two. I'm glad to say. We're talking about the United States. How about States? And what do we have in our so we're going to hopefully make this boxing match. I'm talking to Don King. I can bring Mark Rice and Grace Richard over here because that's going to be I think I'll talk about that. I want to do that. You don't make a goddamn thing at the end of this month. I think that I'm trying to enjoy myself in college. Last one. Hey, I'm keeping that part. Can you make that happen? Well, hey, call me. Hey, listen, put me on. Oh, come on, we'll talk. Okay, perfect. All right, yes. Oh, call me. No, I'm going to call him back. Long time no see it. So glad it was out here. Manager at the highest fucking wide enough, like, hey, that's what happened. I went, hey, check. Hold it. That's the name? No. Hey. Hold it. Man's got 195 legs. Body. Fighters. That. Okay, fine. That's good. Don't worry about it. Take a look. Take a look. Take it back. Looking out for the family. Looking out for the family. I'm pretty much sure that nobody else is doing that. Not married, not fucking praying. Make it right. Well, I do. Oh, yeah, I really. Oh, fine. That's true. Totally the truth. Totally the truth. No problem now. have to have natural, big belief in natural story. That's
Did you know many celebrities own homes that they did not want anyone to know about? Every celebrity had a different reason. But after their death, the homes became public. Also revealing a weird fact about them. Here are the 21 strange celebrity homes that Hollywood tried to hide. Charlie Chaplin. Charlie Chaplin lived in a Beverly Hills home that managed to be both modern and full of whimsy, much like the genius looking home lived in city life and modern times. Built in the 1910s, the building property wasn't small, but it didn't sell. It couldn't let David Street find some. Word had it, Chaplin usually catfished God's nosy reporters or hosted small private parties away from prying eyes. Another theory was a miniature stage on the ground, where he could rehearse comedic bits or test out new ideas before filming. Even though Chaplin is one of the most famous entertainers, he chose to keep the original 1920 Victory side, suggesting he never lost touch with his humble beginning. This unassuming house also provided a personal haven when political tension escalated. McCarthy era, a time that ultimately caused him to leave the United States altogether. Chaplin's love of fun showed up in the garden too, where he installed playful sculptures and fountains, reflecting the light-hearted charm he brought to it. Now privately owned, the home isn't open to public tours, but it still holds a special place in Hollywood. It's a quiet monument to Chaplin's creative spirit, and a reminder that even world-renowned stars need a place to recharge. Gloria Swanson. Gloria Swanson, Beverly Hills actress, often called Casa del Sol, was every bit as dramatic as the star herself. Built in the 1920s with an eye-catching Spanish Moorish style, featured art and jewelry, two 15-foot tiles, and a private chapel. Swanson, who skyrocketed to fame as one of the earliest true Hollywood celebrities, filled the house with exotic collections, including Egyptian artifacts and unique antiques from around the world. Behind the glamorous exterior, however, were a few secrets. The house had a hidden passage that led to a small, out-of-sight room, thought to be used for private meetings, or simply privacy. Some were throwing parties that stood out even from the small festivals. Swanson entertained countless. He's the glow of stars and maintaining such a private city and organization. Financial challenges forced her to sell, and over time, the property passed through various owners. Eventually, Casa del Sol was torn down, erasing the physical remains of the once lavish home. Even so, film fans still speak of it as a symbol of her larger-than-life. The mansion's disappearance serves as a striking reminder that Hollywood's golden moments vanish almost as quickly as they appear. Harold Flynn. Harold Flynn, while Holland Farm, was the first and watched by films like The Adventures of Robin Hood. Immersed in a Hollywood movie and built in the 1940s. Against surrounded by drugs, by them off-street ethics, added all sorts of unconventional touches, including a secret passage leading to a secret bedroom and a two-way door that allowed him to observe visitors by night. He also made practice and a private bar to host lively entertainment. But this extravagant home reflected more than just Flynn's adventurous youth. It also revealed the darker side, and his career began to wane. Mulholland Farm and Jealousy Collection, mirroring actors' own downward spiral. Eventually, the property was sold and, later on, demolished, erasing physical testament to this untamed lifestyle. However, the legend of Mulholland Farm endures. Movie buffs still talk about its mysterious tunnels and rocket as a direct reflection of Flynn's bigger-than-life personality. In the end, it stands as one more reminder of Hollywood's ability to both create and Mae West. Mae West chose a different path than most of us. Bigfoot and the races were protected, even as the industry changed and new generations of cars came and went. Rumors of with some residents claiming that that's her presence in the home. Whether or not it's that powerful symbol of West's fierceness. She did things on her own terms, refusing to be swept away by the latest events. To this day, her name quick comeback, and a woman who refused to let it be second. John Barry. John Barry, elegant at the stage, showcasing the theatrical charm and complex personality of a man often referred to as great profile. Constructed in the 1920s in Beverly Hills, it featured a sprawling layout, complete with a grand library, stuffed with rare books and magazines. Some of them hidden in his apartment, built right into the wall. Barrymore, with his love of classical music, also set up a private stage where he could rehearse Shakespearean roles or entertain a few lucky Gothic-style furniture, dark wood panels, and dramatic lighting underscored his flair for the story. This was no ordinary project. Animals roamed the halls too. Barrymore painted the monkeys and the parrots, letting them wander freely like curious cats. Yet, like all the strangers, and Barrymore's fault worsened and financially had to give up the home. After changing hands, Bella Vista was eventually experiencing a unique monument to Barrymore's bright and troubled life. Even so, stories of hidden bookings and impromptu Shakespeare fascinate fans of Hollywood, reminding them of the actor's undeniable brilliance and haunting violence. Eddie Lamar. Eddie Lamar's Hollywood house was a mix of gloss and genius, just like the star herself. Featured a modern, minimalist design with big windows that let in lots of natural light. The many was the fact that Lamar kids from Hollywood became a private workshop house where he tinkered ideas, produced a groundbreaking frequency-hopping concept that paved the way for technologies like Wi-Fi and Bluetooth. In a town focused on red carpets and glittering shaped her own intellectual passion. She rarely brought visitors to his workshop, and few people knew about her high-level problem solving. That secretive blend of glamour and great power are certainly something of a myth within the film. Though the home itself no longer stands, its memory still resonates with fans who marvel at how Lamar balanced stardom and science at a time when few believed in his ability to also. Her story underlines the depth in beneath Hollywood's country. Movies that create couldn't find anyone here. Even the rebuilt on here. Howard Hughes. Howard Hughes was like a name that mirrored the brilliant but troubled mind of the man who owned it. Purchased in the 1920s, it sat behind small walls and dense doors, offering complete seclusion with its summit, the decor combines both in aviation and he built his own airstrip on the ground, outside workers. As his fears and eccentricity grew, Hughes added influence and fascinated to the layout. For furniture placement, the exact temperature of each room. When the downward turn in 1940-50, the estate felt less like a glamorous retreat and more like a self-contained prison. After his death in the 1970s, the house was eventually sold and Even so, the tales surrounding Newton's life with brilliance, paranoia, and secrecy linger, reminding us that genius often comes with a steep price, and that isolation can be both a comfort and Dolores Del Rio. Dolores Del Rio's Los Angeles home demonstrated her amazing pride in Mexican culture and her willingness to embrace new ideas. Built in the 1920s by forward-thinking architect Richard Nixon, this sleek structure made a bold contrast against the ornate mansion popular among Hollywood elite. Large windows and open floor plans gave the place a clean, minimalist feel that resonated with Del Rio's desire to present a modern take on luxury. Inside, the actress displayed art and items from the home, crafting a personal oasis that let her celebrate. This setup appealed to other creators, painters, writers, and fellow stars like Diego Rivera and Frida Kahlo visited Atlas, finding it a refreshing as Del Rio's career in the United States slowed down. He opted to return to Mexico. Groundbreaking role showcasing modernism in Southern California. For many, Dolores Del Rio's one-time residence stands as a powerful cultural heritage, cutting-edge design, leaving a permanent mark on more than just its location. James Dean's final home, a small bungalow in Sherman Oaks, painted a very different picture of the high-speed life he lived. In the mid-1950s, he settled into this unremarkable, seemingly preferring a quiet space, far from the glitz of public parties. Yet the home still revealed glimpses of Dean's restless energy and strong passion. He famously kept his Porsche 550 Spider, a sports car that would later become tragically famous in a fatal accident. Inside, Dean showed a more reflective side. He spent time sketching, reading scripts, or even experimenting with vodka, hinting at an artistic curiosity that extended beyond that. Escaped the pressure of studio demands, wanting a place where he could after 1935, the bungalow remained mostly acting like a time capsule. Underscores the stark difference between the mythic James Dean and the real person who once lived within those walls, thinking some peace in the world he left all to. Jane Mansfield's home, famously nicknamed the Pink Palace, was unlike any other. Built in the late 1950s in Los Angeles, it was impossible to miss with its bright colors and flamboyant design. People say it reflected Jane's larger-than-life personality, and it certainly should every corner. There was a heart-shaped swimming pool, the mosaic that read, "I love you," and the bold use of pink didn't stop at the carpets. It even covered the walls and ceilings. Her husband, Mickey Architect, who was once Mr. U, added his own touch by installing a fountain that Jane would sometimes fill with pink champagne and sketch together. While it was definitely eye-catching, the house also hinted at Jane's eager need to stand out in a Hollywood scene that often compared her to Marilyn herself. She never settled for blending in, and her pink palace made a loud and clear statement on that. Family, the home met its end in the early 2000s, when it was torn down. Even so, many still remember its wild, over-the-top style. It remains a vivid reminder of a woman who embraced every opportunity to meet them, right up until the end of life. Buster Keaton. Buster Keaton's old Beverly Hills estate felt like a living tribute to Brown. Built in the 1920s, it was stuffed with surprises, from a Roman-style pool with trout stream and course, legends soothe this cherished property, reflecting the broader struggles he faced with communism and his career being confined. Alcohol problems only deepened the difficulties, and the estate after all, it's almost like he could hold on to everything with pushes. Today, his old home is long gone. And film school. It's a bittersweet chapter in Keith's life, reminding us of both his creative heights and the personal and professional challenges he fought against in life. Marion Davis. Marion Davis's ocean house, perched in Santa Monica, was more than just a mansion. It almost felt like a royal palace by the coast. Finished in the 1920s with the financial help of William Randolph Hearst, her powerful partner, the property had over 100 rooms, 55 bathrooms, and 37 fireplaces. Centerpiece was a 110-foot pool, flanked by marble statues and lush greenery. Davies, who went from silent film star to glamorous socialite, through parties that people still talk about, inviting legends like Winston Churchill and Charlie Chaplin. But behind the sparkling events, there was a quieter truth. Marion's home wasn't only about her success, it was also a sign of how much she relied on her. She was a strong-willed figure who sometimes overshadowed her personal goals. Once Hearst's financial troubles hit in the 1930s, the grand estate was broken up, and the main house met the wrecking ball in the 1950s. Though most of it was lost, the guest house and pool live on today as part of the anniversary. In a sense, these survivors stand in the dream stage, and the plot he paid to stay in Hollywood's top circle. Even though the main mansion was gone, the echo of her ambition can still be felt right by the sea. Rudolph Valentino. Rudolph Valentino's Falcon Lair was far more than just a place to sleep. It felt like a grand fortress with an air of mystery. Built in the 1920s in Beverly Crest, it reflected his Italian roots, complete with sprawling gardens, arched doorways, and the building brought to mind. Named after his movie, The Hooded Falcon, the estate became tied to Valentino's private struggles. He poured both money and passion into Falcon Lair, but barely had a chance. Just a few months after this, Valentino died unexpectedly at 31. Warning admirers flocked to the estate. Even flowers. Whispers circulated that Valentino himself bought the home. A rumor that only seemed to grow after his untimely passing. Over time, Falcon Lair switched owners several times, and each new occupant reported odd happenings, like eerie sounds and strange figures. In the early 2000s, the estate was finally demolished, ending in physical presence. Still, its story carries on as a ghost story, a hallmark of a reminder that things shadows like hope and people haunted those who face the close Mary felt like its own image of built in the 1920s, it showcased the power she held as one of Hollywood's earliest superstars. She shared this 42-room estate with Douglas Fairbanks, and they turned it into a gathering spot with some of the biggest names of the time, including Albert Einstein, Charlie Chaplin, and Amelia Earhart. While it was a center of glitz and good times, Fair also housed a darker density about Mary's personal life. After she and Fairbanks divorced in the 1960s, Mary would live in the home, rarely leaving the luxurious sanctuary. Stories say she spent her later years drifting to its lavish living, haunted by memories of the past fame and lost relationships. Then, in the 1970s, had it demolished, citing issues like termite damage and even potential conflicts. That demolition sparked anger among film history enthusiasts, who saw it as the destruction of a treasured piece of authenticity. Though the physical building no longer exists, the name, picture, evokes thoughts of movie stars in their prime. Eventually, it stands for both the shining moments and the departures that often go unnoticed, also over the stars. Douglas Fairbanks. Douglas Fairbanks, known for his daring roles like the Ace of Baghdad and Robin, had a life off-screen that was just as interesting. Although he once shared his character, he also owned another estate in Santa Monica called Fairbanks Ranch. This lush estate was landscape garden, a private lake, and a common boathouse. An avid sportsman, Fairbanks set up a modern gym and a tennis court on the back, hosting spirited matches that attracted Hollywood's brightest stars. One of the most memorable elements of Fairbanks Ranch was a hidden tunnel into the main house hotel. It said he used it either to report those reporters or to stage dramatic entrances to the treasure. But his married men and his movie popularity, Fairbanks found refuge spending more time away from his daughter. Eventually, the property was sold off and subdivided, but the legend remains. The idea of a hidden tunnel and private lake captures the mix of showmanship and seclusion defined Fairbanks history. Even now, the memory of his carefree spirit and athletic lifestyle is fine, reminding us of the time when company stars carved out personal experiences as far as Olive Nut's Garden of Almond, the colorful monument, Sunset Boulevard, that offered a safe haven for Hollywood's more unconventional visitors. A Russian romance, one of the Boston mansions, and transformed it into an open-minded community. He had guests I had to visit state who were excited. Artists, writers, and actors like Dr. Carroll, Greta Garbo, and Errol found refuge. Dawn had a live cabin, and Johnny Mocha's avant-garde outlook. Rumor has it he hosted a but again, urban culture. Giving attendees a place of great praise in usual Hollywood music. However, money woes forced not to eventually, it turned into a hotel that saw its share of ups and downs before it was demolished in the 1950s, making room for strip malls. To most people passing by now, there's little to hint that this spot once buzzed with creativity and out-of-the-box. In the memory of the Garden of Almond, this song is a bold reminder that Hollywood wasn't just about blockbusters and glamour. Sometimes it was a safe space for those who dared to dream. If only for a while. William Randolph Hearst, Pennsylvania State, often called Hearst Castle, was nothing short of monumental. Built from the 1910s onwards, it sprawled over the hills on California's Central Coast, and it ended up with 165 rooms, extensive gardens, and 2 huge swimming pools, one famously decorated with real gold tiles. Hearst, a powerful media tycoon, spared no expense in its authentic European ceilings, tapestries, and sculptures to decorate his massive. A private zoo even roamed the ground, complete with snakes and other exotic creatures. Hearst threw lavish parties for Hollywood stars like Charlie Chaplin and but behind the glitter was a man who liked to call the shots. His longtime companion, actress Marion Davies, often had to balance his extravagant tastes with her own ambitions. Financial strains in the 1930s forced Hearst to sell off a lot of his priceless art, but he managed to keep his commitment. Today, it functions as a state historical monument, where visitors still see the grandeur and excess Hearst soldiers. In many ways, San Simeon stands as a testament to one individual's drive for both power and beauty. Yet it also highlights the pitfalls of living large, as even the mightiest fortunes face tough times and circumstances change. Dean Harlow. Dean Harlow's house in Beverly Hills is delicate to carry the load of chilling stories. It was modest compared to some star homes, yet it became intimate after the sudden death of her husband, Paul Brown. The circumstances around his passing sparked endless debates, stirring up rumors and attracting curious onlookers. Best non-exclusive romantic roles like Brett Butler and John Cena. Gable's private life got a much quieter in 2006. Farmland, Rolling Stone. Gable first was well known as Bart Pipeline. Built in the 1960s, the property is close to grand design like some other Star homes, but it had slightly different charm. Granted, the old man well-kept vehicle blended Gable's property with the outdoors. He often rode horses on the trail, and then became close friends with National Park, rather than the lavish affairs of the Golden Park. The home was like a was able to attractive lives, or simply unwind. Following her success, most notably the death of his wife, Sarah Papa, this ranch became a refuge for locals recall glimpses of him strolling the property at dusk, finding solace in tranquility. Though time and development has changed, the legend of Clark Gable's hidden ranch lives on, reminding fans that even Hollywood royalty sometimes craves a lonely escape. Harry Grant, Gabler on stage, better the life-spent Nevada Penthouse, and Grand Station. Yet his actual Beverly Hills hideaway totally different. Nestled behind tall hedges and understated gates, Grant's home wasn't a palatial mansion, so much as a private space. In privacy, and values that humans explore. This is local customers. They treated as a wish of conservation. Built in the late 1960s, this discreet residence had one canal and a lush garden grant-like entertainment opportunities. These small gatherings were said to be far more relaxed, high society, and even sometimes attended in public. People came to live a handful of guests, enjoying the quiet of the or seeing the latest film and animation movies. Really, with this hour and private insight, providing a insight so planned eventually the house was house. Relying on Star Power. To this story, fans romanticize the idea of a house. Reminding this interpretation often thrives. If you enjoy this video, please leave a like and comment. Also, consider subscribing and hitting the notification to get notified of our videos. Thanks for watching. They wore crowns, but behind the palace doors, they broke every rule. For 1,000 years, Indian royals had hidden the most dangerous secrets in velvet-lined silence until now. In this fairy tale, 30 chapters of obsession, strength, forbidden desire, and power gone sideways. Kings on his right hand, queens rejected by rumor, and heirs who never made it to the throne. You heard the official version. This is what they do. But welcome to the most perverted royal. And no, it doesn't get more respectful from here. rhetoric was total. This was not a monarch who simply died. This was a moral parable aimed at future rulers. Avoid the flesh. There's something suspiciously tidy about the way kings out here. A rival brother conveniently nearby. Henry would ascend within hours. A death in the woods, witnessed only by men who fled. A body unclaimed for hours. And then, of course, the Church's perfect post-mortem victory lap. Which brings us back to the central question. What exactly was William Rufus guilty of? Being unmarried? Perhaps. That was enough to raise eyebrows. Favoring handsome young men? Suspicious. Enjoying courtly pageantry and refusing the Church's due? Practically a confession. Or maybe, just maybe, he was guilty of being inconvenienced. His lifestyle, his policy, his business, unfit for sainthood, but also unfit to fulfill the role. So they turned him into a symbol, a warning, a scandal soaked in implication. His sexuality, whatever it actually was, became political currency. The lack of sleep, the decorative court, perfume, silk, pointed shoes, all stacked like pieces under a verdict nobody could quite prove, but everyone felt very comfortable. Centuries later, historians continue to debate this. Was William gay? Was he celibate? Was he merely indifferent to the entire reproductive agenda of monarchy? Was it a real crime against the church, not against nature? None of these questions have satisfying answers, which makes him perfect for our purpose. Because William Rufus was less a person than a prisoner, a way to reflect the moral fears of his age, sexual, religious, dynastic, and twisted into a narrative of deserved death. A topic was literally survived, dumped unceremoniously in a cathedral, seems to ask, are you sure you want to believe, or are you just here for a good explanation? And if that's unprecedented, wait a minute. Correct way. His younger brother Henry was accused of his large wife. Henry wives and his throne. The man who had rehearsed the moment. While his brother lay cooling in the new forest, Henry rode hard for Winchester, seized the royal treasury, and declared himself king before anyone had time to ask uncomfortable questions about arrows, witnesses, or abandoned corpses. History would later debate William's immorality. Henry had no intention of being made about his legitimacy. He married quickly. He crowned himself decisively. And then, quietly, he began leaving a trail of children across England that no one could possibly ignore. Henry George had more acknowledged illegitimate children than any English monarch before or since. Records, marriages, ranches, land grants, church votes, if he didn't deny them, he curated them. By medieval standards, kings were not expected to be monogamous saints. Discretion, however, was for experiment. Henry ensured that entirely. His private life filled his public administration with the confidence of a man who believed the rules were for other people. His mistresses came from no family, nor circle, and politically sensitive households. His children were raised openly, educated carefully, and inserted into the machinery of power. This wasn't indulgence, it was policy. Chroniclers struggle to describe it. Morally, often quiet. Henry was competent, brutally competent. In restored order after his brother's chaos, tightened royal justice, and stabilized himself. Long streets of public. High, quietly filed away under acceptable compromise. As long as Henry lived, his personal excesses were manageable. But kingdoms do not end when kings die. They unravel afterwards. Henry's solution to the succession crisis was bold, unprecedented, and deeply unsettling event. He named his daughter Empress Matilda as his heir. He forced the nobility to swear loyalty to him, again and again. On paper, this should have settled the matter. In reality, it did the opposite. Henry's reign had trained England to accept ambiguity. Illegitimate children with power. Bloodlines that mattered and didn't matter simultaneously. Authority enforced by competence rather than tradition. When Henry died in 1135, the kingdom was left with a question it no longer knew how to answer cleanly. What exactly makes a ruler legitimate? The answer came swiftly and violently. Nations below seized the throne. Civil war followed. The period known as the Anarchy or England apart. And beneath the surface of the conflict, beneath castles changing hands and oaths being broken, lingered Henry's shadow. His personal life, once tolerated as a private indulgence, now looks like a warning label everyone has ignored. His illegitimate children didn't cause the war. They were symptoms of a deeper issue, a monarchy that had stretched the boundaries of inheritance, loyalty, and moral authority until they snapped back unpredictably. In retrospect, Henry's sexuality and relationships weren't scandalous because they were excessive. They were scandalous because they were unapologetically integrated into government. He treated intimacy as a political resource. And politics eventually returned the favor with interest. Later chroniclers softened their tone. Compared to Rufus, Henry was respected. He attended church. He married. He ruled wisely. But the numbers are down. The genealogies could be erased. There's linger, not of travesty, but of overreach. Henry derived from something profoundly uncomfortable for medieval England, that a king could be both morally suspect and administratively brilliant, that private conduct didn't always do public success, and that the consequences of personal choices might take decades to surface, long after the man himself was deeply buried. His reign ended quietly. His legacy did not. And looming over that legacy was a woman who had watched, learned, ruled, and been judged far more harshly than any man. One whose independence would be repackaged by enemies as scandal, corruption, and dangerous autonomy. Because if Henry taught England to tolerate excess, Eleanor of Aquitaine, how much of that tolerance terrified them? If you're still here after that, a journey through political bedchambers and medieval moral crises, then you clearly belong here. So before we dive headfirst into the next royal entanglement, take a second to officially join the strange velvet curtain chaos. Hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and let us know down in the comments. Where are you watching from and what time is it right now? Midnight in Manchester? 3 a.m. in Manila? We're building the global circle of night owls, history nerds, and scandal enthusiasts. You're in good company. Now, back to the next royal whose personal life could have toppled a kingdom. 3. Eleanor of Aquitaine. Eleanor of Aquitaine didn't need to misbehave to become scandalous. She only needed to exist loudly. Born into one of the most powerful inheritors. Eleanor arrived in history already breaking rules that had not yet been written down. She was wealthy in her own right, educated, politically fluent, and catastrophically unwilling to shrink herself to fit the expectations of medieval womanhood. That alone would have been enough to make her dangerous. Everything else simply gave her enemies better vocabulary. When Eleanor married Louis VII of France, she was still a teenager. The marriage was meant to be an alliance. Instead, it became a disappointment wrapped in theology. Louis was pious, hesitant, inward-looking. powerful woman who leads a cycle simply to the height of something. The logic is circular and airtight. A woman with influence must be immoral. Evidence of immorality proves she should not have influence. Eleanor became influence and remained inconveniently herself. She traveled, she held court, she patronized poets, she advised, she disagreed, and most dangerously, she remembered that Aquitaine was hers, not her husband, hers. Medieval chroniclers struggled with this. When they couldn't criticize their government directly, they criticized her virtues. When they couldn't find evidence, they implied appetite. The Crusade provided fertile ground. Eleanor accompanied Louis VII on the Second Crusade, an act that was already scandalous by implication. Queens were symbols, not partitions. Her presence, surrounded by noble women, became a magnet for rumors. Later writers claimed she behaved improperly, encouraged luxury, or disrupted discipline. Some suggested relationships that conveniently explain why the crusade failed. Because clearly, the collapse of a massive military religious campaign required a woman-shaped scapegoat. Modern historians note the pattern with weary familiarity. Eleanor's supposed sexual misconduct always coincided with moments where she exercised authority, visibility, or independence. The accusations were less about behavior and more about discomfort. A woman who could not be controlled had to be reframed as a woman who could not control herself. Her marriage to Henry II deteriorated spectacularly. They produced children, many children, these rebels, future legends. The partnership gave way to rivalry. Eleanor backed her sons during their revolt against Henry, an act that sealed her reputation as not just immoral, but dangerous. She was imprisoned for years, politically, not penitentially. Her confinement was about power, not propriety. And yet, the sexualized rumors never stopped. Chroniclers painted her as manipulative, excessive, indulgent. They hinted at impropriety with courtship. They recycled older accusations. The goal was never truth. It was narrative control. If Eleanor could be remembered as licentious, her political agency could be dismissed as corruption rather than confidence. After Henry's death, Eleanor emerged from captivity and ruled as queen mother with startling effectiveness. She negotiated ransoms, secured succession, managed crises. But memory is written by those who fear precedent. A woman who ruled too well had to be explained away, so the legends grew. Mean, she became a symbol of excess, of romantic danger, of female appetite masquerading as authority. Never mind that male rulers with mistresses were described as virile. Eleanor was described as destabilizing. The same actions filtered through a different body became a scandal. The irony is brutal. Eleanor's actual private life remains largely opaque. What survives is not evidence but accusation, not testimony but tone. Her sexuality became a canvas for other people's anxieties, about female power, inheritance, autonomy, and the frightening idea that leadership might not belong exclusively to women. She lived into old age. She outlived husbands, enemies, and most of her children. She died respected, feared, and still faintly scandalous. Not because of what she did in private, but because she refused to behave like a supporting character in someone else's reign. Eleanor's story teaches a crucial lesson for understanding royal perversion. Sometimes the scandal isn't excess. Sometimes it's independence. Sometimes the most unforgivable sin is competence without permission. And perhaps the most unsettling part is this. Her legacy didn't end with her. Because one of her sons would inherit not just her intelligence and authority, but also the same cloud of sexual ambiguity, moral speculation, and rumor-driven judgment. A king who would become a legend of bravery, devotion, and absence, and whose private life would be dissected with the same suspicious hunger once reserved for his mother. History. Richard I was the kind of monarch history prefers in Austria. He negotiated with emperors and sultan kings, and occasionally remembered to send updates home. For a man crowned as the sovereign of England, he treated the place like a mildly interesting summer estate, visited rarely, taxed often, and always held a devotional arm's length. And yet, for all his physical distance, Richard was large in English legend. Ancient king who wasn't there, and somehow became synonymous with England himself. Defender of his faith, crusader, saintly warrior, patron of the cause, perfect Christian knight, except of course for that uncomfortable footnote. The rumors. Richard's reign and his reputation have always carried with them a strange kind of tension. The gap between the holy warrior myth and the whispered suspicions that he might not have been quite so holy or quite so straight. The accusations then and now are slippery. No one ever caught him. No one ever documented a smoking love letter or a compromising incident. What we have instead is that oldest of royal poison, implication. Medieval chroniclers, especially those writing after his death, were fond of placing him in morally complex shadows. There are penitential tales, Richard confessing to sins of the flesh, including the ambiguous sodomy. There are records of unusually close male friendships, described in terms that left just enough room for suspicion. And there's the noticeable lack of certain expected behaviors for a king of this era, namely, a queen and heir. Berengaria of Navarre. He was crowned queen of England. He almost certainly never set foot in the country. Their union produced no children, and if you blinked, you might miss her entirely in the historical record. Contemporary sources remark, rather diplomatically, that they spent little time together. Modern biographers are slightly less charitable, often noting that the marriage seemed more like a diplomatic checkbox than a relationship. But this, in itself, wasn't entirely shocking for the time. Royal marriages were rarely about affection, and heirs could be produced with other women. Just ask Henry I. What made Richard's private life suspicious was not the lack of children, but the quality and intensity of his relationships with certain male courtiers. Foremost among them, Philip II of France. Richard and Philip had an unusually close relationship during the early Crusade years. They dined together. They campaigned together. They shared a bed, an arrangement that, and medieval chroniclers occasionally mention, often with a note of discomfort or coy ambiguity. It wasn't necessarily sexual. Shared beds were not uncommon among nobility. But the tone of some sources suggested that there was more than diplomacy at work. One 12th century chronicler noted that Richard and Philip loved each other so much that the King of England would daily eat and sleep in the same bed as the King of France. Again, this could be innocent. Or it could be political poetry masking something more. Later writers, especially in the Renaissance and beyond, would take these hints and run with them. Some described Richard as openly sodomitical. Others rejected the idea entirely, insisting that his penitential behavior later in life was proof of repentance rather than confirmation. The Church, ever ready to insert itself into historical memory, helped shape the narrative by recording Richard's acts of penance, often public and possibly performative. He did penance in Sicily, in Rome, after battles, before campaigns. It became part of his public routine. Sin, confess, atone. But what was he confessing? His anger? His pride? His bloodshed? Or something else, less visible or whispered? No one knows. And perhaps that's why modern historians approach this official sexual terminology, putting that sodomy could mean anything from actual sexual behavior to mere political favoritism. Others highlight the broader context, how male intimacy, when combined with power, could easily become suspect. In a court culture obsessed with masculinity, virtue, and legacy, any deviation from the expected became potential scandal. And then, of course, there's the strategic silence. Richard's court produced few open references to his private affections. There are no grand romantic letters, no detailed accusations, nothing that would satisfy modern curiosity. Instead, we get fragments, defensive chronicler, disapproving monastics, odd silences, repeated penance, a queen who disappears, a reputation shaped less by what he did and more by what he did. In depth, Richard became more legend than man, the Lionheart, Crusader king, defender of the realm. But underneath the metal and myth is a much quieter figure, unmarried, careless, emotionally distant, and persistently ambiguous. His sexuality remains a historical mystery not because of what we know, because of what we can't stop speculating. Every silence in the record becomes a question mark. Every closed male friendship becomes suspicious. Every absence becomes presence. And that absence matters. Because Richard's lack of an heir triggered more than just gossip. It set the stage for succession crises, rebellions, and a very familiar narrative. A king's private life turning into a public problem. His younger brother John inherited the throne. For Richard was the absent saint. John was the present disgrace. And if the Lionheart was shadowed by rumors of who he loved, John would be damned for how he treated those who refused him. Because Richard left behind a throne, and John left behind claw marks. 5. King John, King of England. If Richard was the king whose mystery kept him just out of reach, John was the king whose sins practically kicked the palace doors open and dared history to look away. King John, of Magna Carta fame, Robin Hood villainy, and chronicles of loathing, has a rare distinction of being universally disliked. His enemies loathed him. His allies distrusted him. The church excommunicated him. And when the barons finally rebelled, they made it a moral event. Divine correction, a national exorcism. Greed, cowardice, was a recurring and poisonous theme. Sexual predation. Horses don't mince words, though they do cloak their accusations in the pious outrage of chroniclers. John said, was a ravaged a defiler of brides, a king who treated aristocratic families as if they were part of his private inventory. When a noble married, he watched his back and his daughter's door. The king's attention was a liability. King John is the very embodiment of his truth. He was a king, yes, but worse. He was oblivious, not charming, not seductive, not even scandalous in the way kings were sometimes indulgently forgiven for being. John's interest in women was described as invasive, unrelenting, and, crucially, politically destabilizing. That last part is key. Medieval kings were expected to be above their vices. A mistress here or there was tolerable, especially if kept discreet. But John's behavior, at least as described by his critics, crossed the line. He didn't just indulge, he coerced. He didn't just pursue, he humiliated. The records suggest a pattern of behavior in which women were seen not as partners but as leverage, ways to pressure their families, manipulate noble loyalty, or punish defiance. Whether all these accounts are accurate is impossible to say. Chroniclers in the early 13th century were as political as they were religious. They wrote for patrons. They framed their narratives to justify rebellion. A hated king's moral failings became convenient ammunition. It's hard to separate reality from polemic, but even propaganda leaves fingerprints of truth. What we know for certain is this. By the early 1200s, John's reputation among the nobility had collapsed. Lords feared for their daughters, not just their lands. The perception was widespread that the king was not romantic, but strategic. That he used his power not merely to punish political enemies, but to shame their husbands. The term lechery appears again and again, not just as a moral insult, but as a weaponized label. To be ruled by John was not just dangerous, it was indecent, and it wasn't limited to noble women. Some accounts describe John taking women from his wives of merchants, servants, widows, He had, in the words of one monk, no regard for law or tradition. In other words, he broke the unspoken social contract. The idea that kings, while powerful, must observe a minimum standard of restraint. John replaced restraint with appetite, preference with impulse. It's worth noting that the most famous political document in English history, the Magna Carta, contains a clause about royal marriage arrangements and women's rights. This is the king forcing noblemen to marry against their will. That clause didn't emerge in a vacuum. It was a direct response to the way John had wielded female autonomy as a political cudgel. Even his diplomatic behavior betrayed the same pattern. In a world where royal marriages were chess pieces, John had a habit of turning the board over. He famously snatched Isabel of Angoulême out from under the nose of a powerful local lord who was betrothed to her. The move was technically legal. John had power, but it created lasting resentment, triggered a rebellion, and his reputation further. Isabel was young, politically valuable, and suddenly queen. Her family's resentment helped push French barons into open opposition. Once again, John's pursuit of a woman had geopolitical consequences, and that, in the end, was his real sin. It wasn't that he was immoral, it was that his immorality was bad for business. Kings could sin, but only if they sinned safely. John's scandals weren't private affairs, they were public liabilities. They turned allies into enemies. They turned daughters into diplomatic flashpoints. They made every noble threat. And when the rebellion came, the sexual narrative followed close behind. The barons didn't just accuse him of unjust taxation or foreign mismanagement. They described the king as wild the land and people alike. Could not be trusted with power because he could not control himself. His body became an instrument of national corruption. His desires became metaphors for tyranny. After his death in 1216, England did not mourn. His body was buried in Worcester Cathedral with as much dignity as could be offered. But the collective sigh of relief echoed louder than the funeral process. Over the centuries, has been more studied than celebrated. A symbol not of reverence, but of mourning. And in this sense, John's story fits neatly into the larger royal pattern. When private appetites threaten public order, the scandal becomes systemic. And when the church and nobility align in moral condemnation, a king's body becomes the battlefield. But if John's story is about aggressive excess, the next chapter in royal scandal turns inward. Because the line between favoritism and affection is always thin. Isn't a wife or a mistress, but a young male nobleman. The kingdom begins. What if the real threat is what the king did? What does he choose to give everything to? Edward II, King of England. If King John made a mess of power by wielding it too aggressively, Edward II made an entirely different kind of mess by giving it away too intimately. Where John pulled over the nobility with force and appetite, Edward was favored. And not just advisors or allies, but young men who, in the eyes of his court, looked suspiciously like lovers and acted dangerously like kings. He was the kind of monarch who battled with barons, physically imposing but politically passive. Born under the shadow of the forefathers, Edward's version of the hammer of the gods. He inherited not just a kingdom, but an impossible masculine ideal. His father had been all grit and conquest. Edward preferred rustic cottages and private company with men no one at court could quite figure out how to talk about without lowering their voices. The name Piers Gaveston appears early and often in the story. Gaveston was a Gascon knight of minor nobility, brought into Edward's household in his youth. As the prince grew into adulthood, so did the bond. By the time Edward became king in 1307, Gaveston was more than a friend. He was a fixture, showered with titles, lands, and privileges that Gaveston was just well treated. He was elevated to a level that many considered politically blasphemous. barons protested. They issued formal complaints. They insisted that Gaveston was arrogant, flamboyant, and dangerously influential. What they really meant, of course, was that he had earned it, but through blood or service. He earned it through intimacy, the closeness, and then came the rumors. The language of the time rarely spoke plainly, but it didn't need to. Accusations of undue familiarity and corruption of the realm and raised eyebrows. Churchmen cited moral decay. Political pamphlets didn't accuse Edward of love. They accused him of being unmanly. Thought, once again, became the all-purpose term for what couldn't be comfortably named. Modern historians debate the nature of Edward's relationships. Was he gay by modern definitions? Bisexual? Emotionally dependent? It may be impossible to say. What matters more is how his court responded, with outrage, fear, and eventually rebellion. Villa of France, a diplomatic union, brokered to create peace between England and France. But the marriage began with a public insult. Gaveston was the true consort. He took precedence at court events. He received more lavish gifts. He walked beside the king as if the marriage were merely a political inconvenience. It didn't last. Political pressure mounted. The nobility forced Gaveston's exile, then his return, then exile again. Eventually, they had him hunted down and executed, without trial, and with full awareness of how deeply it would wound the king. It wasn't just a power play. It was a warning. Favoritism has limits, and Edward ignored it. Gaveston was replaced in time by the dispenser, Hugh the Younger and his father. The same pattern reemerged. Elevation, rewards, court dominance, and once again, suspicion. The dispensers were even more hated than Gaveston. Their rise was seen not as a restoration of order, but as a continuation of Edward's personal resistance, a world in which emotional closeness became an unchecked story. This time, the consequences were greater. A baronial revolt erupted. Civil war followed. And while the dispensers became symbols of tyranny, Edward's own position grew weaker by the hour. His failure to lead, combined with his reliance on favorites, created a portrait of a king who could neither govern nor be governed. And then Isabella re-entered the story, not as a sideline queen, but as the central figure in the coup that would topple her husband. Alliance with Roger Morton, politically, perhaps more, became the foundation for Edward's deposition. He returned from exile and raised an army. He did so with the language of national salvation. The king, they said, had allowed immoral people to corrupt the court. The realm had been led astray. The family had been dishonored. In 1327, Edward II became the first English monarch to be formally deposed by Parliament. The charges against him included not just misrule, but giving himself up to improper pursuits and loving those who did not merit his regard. It wasn't just about failure, it was about innocence. He was imprisoned. The dispensers were executed, graphically, publicly, and with ritualistic cruelty designed to cleanse the court. The message was clear. Kings who love unwisely are unfit to rule. Edward's death remains a mystery. The official story, death by illness, has never satisfied historians. The mistake, assassination, or something worse, have circled for centuries. But as with so much in his reign, the details are less important than the symbolism. He was a king undone not by enemies, but by affection. His sin, in the eyes of his contemporaries, wasn't war or greed or cruelty. It was emotional dependence on men who weren't supposed to matter. The scandal wasn't just personal, it was structural. Edward's intimacy disrupted the machinery of feudal politics. His favoritism created a vacuum where rule was supposed to be. And into that vacuum poured all the anxieties of a kingdom, still unsure how to define power, masculinity, or loyalty. And yet, despite Isabella of France